It gives me lots of pleasure to declare the Rainbow Room reopened.
Ka whakatūwhera te mana whakawā i te taiwhanga uenuku i te whare pāre mato o Aotearoa. Ana i te kōrero.
O kia ora mai no tātou, ko Loisa Wolaho. I'm the MP for Manurewa. This room is incredibly special and important to me because it signifies the history of Rainbow Members of Parliament and it also signifies our legislative history. So it did really start with homosexual law reform. And then as we've progressed through the years, we've had civil unions, we've had marriage equality, but we've also had pioneers and leaders within our LGBT community. And for me, it really is about legacy.
When Europeans first came to our country, they found a people that were far more sex positive. They were not comfortable with what appeared to be a very relaxed attitude to same-sex sexuality. And so immediately they took steps to try and criminalise it, to suppress it. In fact, they worked really, really hard to pretend that it never existed at all. A big part, I believe, of decolonisation is to go back and find those stories. And we use the word takatapui. It's a traditional word. It means intimate companion of the same sex, but we've embraced that to include all of us, all Māori with diverse genders, sexualities and sex characteristics. And that includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex and queer, but actually many other identities that people may not even have names for just yet. We have, as takatapui over the years, dealt with that in many, many ways. Some of us have gone into hiding. Some of us have lived the heterosexual life that society has wanted for us. And so the rest of us must continue to fight, must continue to advocate, must continue to open doors, particularly for our young people.
In 1974, then Young, who was an opposition member of Parliament, was going to introduce a homosexual law reform bill. The Prime Minister at the time, Norman Clerk, said he couldn't support it because he couldn't support anything that wasn't normal behaviour. I read that headline of the Dominion and I got up from the table and I walked straight and joined the National Party. In 1976, when I was 23 years old and a backbench member of the national government, I was outed by Truth newspaper, who ran the story for something like 6 weeks. They were so angry that this had been picked on, that a young woman had been picked on, in a context where, prior to this, pretty much MPs' private lives in this kind of public announcement. In 78 to 81, I was the only woman in the National Party caucus. Fortunately, Catherine O'Regan, who had been my electoral agent, in 1983 when I told her I was going to retire, I said, I'm letting you know really early in case you'd like to run for it. And she did, and she won. She became the Associate Minister of Health. The government introduced an amendment to the Human Rights Commission Act. She did something really extraordinary. As a minister, she moved an amendment to expand the grounds of discrimination to include sexual orientation, who were suffering from HIV and AIDS and other transmittable, notifiable diseases.
I was a young solo mother with 3 primary school age children. The gay community members had lobbied me and said, look, we need a bill introduced by somebody who will actually promote it and run a campaign. And after the 1984 election, I introduced what was then called the Homosexual Law Reform Bill. 2 parts. Part 1 was decriminalisation. Part 2 was an amendment to the Human Rights Act. It was a very bitter campaign. It was fought not just in Parliament but on the streets. There was a lot of hate mail, there were death threats, the police were very good. But there were wonderful moments as well, and I do remember when the petition was being heard, a messenger arrived with a huge bunch of spring bulbs, beautiful perfume, and I thought, that's lovely. So it was just somebody I didn't know, I think, in the gay community who'd sent me these flowers. And of course they were very supportive.
I've been a public servant most of my life, and in my first 6 months of working in Wellington, came to Parliament buildings when the anti-petition was being handed over, and I've got very strong memories of, one, the fact that we were locked out because we were on the other side of the fence. The fact that this huge semi-military process was being enacted in front of us where all these very neatly uniformed men basically were handing over the petition in these huge boxes. And the overwhelming sort of response of Fran Wild, which was just fabulous. She was standing on, I think, a ladder or something. She was certainly standing up high, conducting us all singing the national anthem to try and give a counter to this very jingoistic kind of procession. It was highly motivating, and I think it pushed a lot of us towards lobbying and some of the marches that went on, and then sort of culminated in law reform going through by Catherine O'Regan, and will remain eternally grateful for her, because liberal causes, I think, for somebody like Fran was appropriate. For Catherine O'Regan, it made her no friends, but she pushed through anyway, and she pushed through anti-discrimination for HIV positive men, and that was just brilliant.
The real heroes were the men who came out during the campaign, because we had to prove to New Zealand that gay men were not a threat. They were just the person they worked with, the person next door, their colleague, or their son, or in some cases, sadly, their husband. So many men came out, and of course they took a huge risk because they were criminal, and had the bill not succeeded, that would have been the most terrible blight on their lives forever. So it was great. It wasn't a huge majority, but we got it through, and of course the sky didn't fall in, Western civilization didn't collapse. The world just went on. And for me, this is probably the one bit of legislation that has had the most impact on the most people. So I'm still very proud that I was able to do it.
I was honoured to be the first out gay MP in the New Zealand Parliament. I came out in 1994 when I was a new MP elected for the constituency of Te Atatū. When I was a government minister, I was the Minister of Housing at the time, I was in Australia, and I met a young New Zealand woman in a bar there, and she said to me, "You saved my life." And I said, "How could that be? I've never met you before." And she said, "You were my local MP, you came to my school during prize giving, and I was struggling with my sexuality. I had very religious parents, and I had been considering suicide." And she said, "I watched you on the stage all night, and you were the big man. You were being honoured by everybody. You were our local MP and you were a government minister. And I thought afterwards, if it's okay for Chris Carter, it's okay for me." Now that was just one story, but it had a huge impact on me. I thought, if all of the hostility that I endured as the first out gay MP, all of that was worth it, just for that story alone, where that young woman said that I prevented her from committing suicide. And that affected me a lot and made me very proud.
Probably I was the first MP to be elected, having been reported in the media before being elected as being gay. The journey around civil unions began. Initially, really at the behest of the then Prime Minister, Helen Clark, began a process of talking with rainbow communities around what kind of model was wanted, and it was clear that marriage at that stage globally was just too new a concept to really be able to get through. So we went through an interesting debate on that one. The majority of the civil union was only, I think, 10 votes, so it was a pretty tight debate. But looking back on it now, it's amazing that only a few years later, marriage equality went through overwhelmingly. So it showed that this Parliament has been a place that has been prepared to lead on occasions, and that's a welcome relief.
So when I was young, the only visible transgender woman in New Zealand was Georgina Bayer, and she was a hero to me and the only real person that I could look up to as a young trans person. And now I get to enjoy being an adult in New Zealand and know that the path was cleared for me by someone who was really powerful and inspirational.
I have often been credited with having been a trailblazer, and I will accept that as being true, because as the first out transsexual to serve in a parliament, I had no mentors. I had to navigate my way myself through the mire of political life, I guess. Yes, I had the support of colleagues and a supportive caucus, and that we were serving in government was a huge advantage. I guess I acquitted myself very well when we had what has now come to be known as the Enough is Enough March, led by the Destiny Church, when the 8,000 arrived at Parliament to protest against civil unions. It was a dark day, I feel. I stood on those steps for the 2 or 3 hours that they held their rally in front of Parliament, holding the rainbow flag, joined by other members of Parliament, Sue Bradford, Sue Kedgley, Tim Barnett, Chris Carter, various others came out to support me as I stared them down from the steps of Parliament. At one point, I just lost it. We had 150, approximately, of our supporters who were pro the Civil Union Bill, and they had been surrounded by the 8,000 Destiny Church people. And they were abused, they were jostled, they were shoved, and I could see all of this happening from the steps. At that point, I was so angry, I suppose, I marched across the forecourt of Parliament, yelling out loudly, "Why do you hate us so much? What is this? What is this that you're teaching your children, this hatred towards us? It's not right," and words to that effect. I was yelling, which I seemed like a screaming banshee, because they had a sound system the Rolling Stones would have been proud of. So I was trying to shout over that so that they might hear me. That ended up on the news that night, and many of our rainbow people around the country went to hallelujah. Our voices there to stare down this great adversity we were facing from these people. One of the proudest moments in my parliamentary life, I have to say. Sorry for getting a bit emotional about it, but it was significant. And of course, civil unions came to pass, and then was followed, less than 10 years later, by Lewis Wall's presentation of marriage equality to the country. And considering the venal debate that happened over civil unions throughout the country, marriage equality managed to slip through, pretty well supported from within the Parliament, and more importantly, from a majority of New Zealanders. You see, with patience and perseverance, the country, by and large, will come on board because they can see all we want is equality. We are of no harm to anyone else. We just want to enrich our own lives with equality. And it has been for the better of New Zealand that we have been able to make positive contributions to our country and to live lives that are far more liberated than when I was young. Well done, New Zealand.
It was my pleasure to, as a backbench MP, propose a marriage equality legislation here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. One of the first things we did was establish a cross-party working group, and this gives me an opportunity to acknowledge Kevin Haig, a very active member of our LGBT community, and also Tau Henare. And so I really want to acknowledge all of Parliament who came together at that time with external allies. We also had others, those based in Wellington and Hamilton and Auckland throughout the country, who established marriage equality committees in each of those cities, and then we had towns who were actively engaged. It was a very special time, so extending that right to all New Zealanders, consenting adults who want to engage in the marriage process, I think for us has been a beautiful thing.
One of the things I got to do as the Justice Minister that I'm most proud of was create the first ever in New Zealand's history expungement scheme where we could take convictions, historical convictions for homosexual conduct, and wipe them from the record as if they'd never occurred. And as part of creating that law and introducing it to Parliament, I gave, on behalf of the government and people of New Zealand, an apology to the men who were unfairly traumatised and stigmatised over many years for just being who they are. And of course the scheme we created is certainly a New Zealand first, if not a world first, in that it goes back, wipes those convictions from the record as if they never occurred. So for the first time, the men, or sometimes the descendants of the men affected, are able to know that they were not criminals, that they don't have to bear the stigma of being judged to be somehow wrong in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of society. What was really powerful for me was to hear the stories of the men and their families, how much it had affected them, how much the apology meant to them. And actually one of the really special things was the way Parliament came together. Giving that speech in the House, hearing the speeches from around the House, it really is Parliament at its best when we can look back and say we do need to recognise that in that case Parliament got it wrong. And it's something that I'm incredibly proud of and will be very proud of long after I finish my time in Parliament.
I was diagnosed with an intersex variation when I was 16 years old. Intersex is an umbrella term to describe people born with variations of sex characteristics which don't clearly fit the binary definition of a male or female body. It's really exciting to see the level of rainbow representation, particularly here at Parliament. I was part of a host raupu for the ILGA World Conference. We had people here from well over 100 different countries who were astounded to see not only rainbow flags flying outside Parliament, but MPs here proudly saying that they were members of a rainbow community.
Our Parliament is incredibly inclusive. I can say that I feel respected, that I feel valued, that I have never experienced anything that I would classify as homophobic, where I've been explicitly excluded because I'm a lesbian. Takatapui. I'm incredibly grateful that we've had an upgrading of the room. I do want to acknowledge that the origins of this room come from Tim Barnett and also Speaker Margaret Wilson.
We identified this as being an appropriate place in the same corridor to continue the pattern of rooms, and that's where it all started. I think having a room where there's a physical embodiment of the Crown's commitment to diversity, LGBTIQAP+ rights is really powerful.
Te Whanawhana and Lagans, two of the boards that I'm on, were instrumental in the creation of this original Rainbow Room, and we were here for the opening. It just felt so auspicious that we were creating something that probably doesn't exist in many places in the world. I created this artwork called Mana Takatapui in my final year of art school, and this particular piece spoke about us being able to have our own voice, having our own integrity and the right to stand. And the two major designs in the artwork are the pautama, so representing whakapapa, and the other design is the kaukau, and that's about leadership.
In recent times, I have heard the terms, tōku reo, tōku oho oho, which is our voice as part of the wider collective voice of Māori. So if we as takatapui are not well, then Māori is not well. The Rainbow Room and the progress that has been made, I think, reflects that we have moved towards LGBTI rights or rainbow rights, human rights, not just gay rights.
I think in New Zealand we're really privileged and really lucky that we have had legislation pass and kind of our community has got the rights that we do have today, and we're in the place that we are. We've made some really awesome steps towards that through some of the legislation that's passed.
10 years ago, some of our young people didn't even know that they could survive to the age they're at today. And now with a room like the Rainbow Room saying to them that you can become a member of Parliament, it helps to support their goals and aspirations and let them know that this is a society that appreciates and recognises them.
It seemed quite appropriate, given the proud history we have in this country over rainbow issues, that we should have a Rainbow Room, a representation for our community in a solid bricks and mortar sense here at Parliament. And here it is.